you noticed, and I'd like to take a moment to talk about what strategies or instructional moves did you see again from the teacher or from students?
Well, the same moves previously done, right? But now in English. And the moves don't translate, they're the same.
Yeah. And you can go on the other two too. What language do you see or hear from the teacher? And then what language do you see or hear from the students?
Again, they were producing, can you hear me?
Yeah.
They were producing some writing together, and they were specific about that connection between the particles in Spanish to the English, the or the.
Mm-hmm.
And they were mostly speaking English with making the connection to the Spanish words.
Mm-hmm.
Or the other way around, mostly Spanish and then making the connection to English.
Mm-hmm.
And I love how she point out the difference on the word pone. Here,
Okay, take care of him.
she pretty much took care of it. That is not the same translation in English because it's not used in academic language. In this case, it was referring to the verb to hatch. Or I love her explanation because it's so clear with the movements, and she did specifically every, like when she showed them cognitives too, cognies, it was just fabulous. Even if they didn't really understand, they can totally see once she put it, the other examples.
And Julie, I have to agree with Annabelle. I saw it both ways, like Spanish to English, but also English to Spanish. But I'm a little confused because how would the bridge look in dual immersion? Because I wouldn't want to reteach the lesson that was done in Spanish. So how would that look for me?
Great question. So we'll kind of jump ahead and not from the reflection. So just to let you know, the bridge, if you're following along in the book, is chapter 10. And so again, it starts with oracy. So what's really nice about how we have these video demonstrations and them doing it from the same unit is that you get to see the oracy development in the beginning and then jump to the bridge. And the whole point is exactly what you guys called out is you're not doing something totally new. You're using the same words, the same movements and gestures, and even some of the same exact pictures that you used in the beginning, because it's all about repetition. And with the bridge, you're not trying to teach a new concept. You're trying to transfer the content and concept understanding and give labels in another language to it. And it's not just about learning the English vocabulary, but about then going into the linguistic characteristics between the two languages so they understand how they each work. And so the bridge starts with oracy, and then who provides the language? So the teacher asked, this is just an aside, so the teacher, if you notice, she didn't have the anchor chart already done, and she also didn't have the list of words right there, for her to write out. She asked the students, give me some of the words we used, or they might have gone through the cycle first. All right, let's practice this. Okay, what are the words we used? Or tell me again, and write it down. So it's all about the students producing language. How it would look in a classroom, and we can keep talking about this as we kind of go through the steps of the bridge, but and I think it calls it out directly in the book too. In a one teacher model, it's much more easy to kind of say like, okay, we're going to do this. Okay, now I step, and I put on my English hat. And for her, which was one of the guidelines that we talked about in the last session, if you notice, when she puts a scarf on, that is her signal that she's in English. And then when the scarf is off, she is in Spanish. So if you had a 2-teacher model, with most of us do, you'd have a couple options. And these options kind of go through depending on what you're going to do for the extension, the next part too. So one option you would have is that it becomes a combined lesson. You are putting all of your kids together at the time. And remember, it is once a unit. And if you're doing it from Spanish to English and English to Spanish, at most, you're doing it once every 2 to 3 weeks. But it could go as long as 4 to 6 weeks before you do a bridge. So it might look like an afternoon on a Wednesday or a Friday that for 30 minutes to an hour, you have all of your classes combined and you guys are team teaching it. And one stays in Spanish as much as possible and one stays in English as much as possible. When it gets to the bridge, there has been a real big push that you are very cognizant as a teacher of staying in one language. And the reason for that is not to try to tell students like, this is English only time or this is Spanish only time. But so like we talked about with some of the confusion between switching back and forth, it's harder to develop a language if you're kind of moving fluidly and if you're seeing words to decipher, well, is that an English word or a Spanish word? Because some of them are spelled the same, but pronounced differently and have different meaning. So it's more important that the teachers are staying in their set language allocation than the students. The students might move a little more fluidly during the bridge because they're trying to translate or transfer and play with the language. So that one way you could do it is you have your team teaching the bridge. So Stacy, for you, that might look like you and Denise come together and have all of your kids together. And if they already learned something in Spanish, she does that intro part with them. And then you come in with English and go over that same thing. And they practice their TPR, they do the hand movements, and then you're going to keep doing the same exact thing and say, all right, well, now we're going to practice it in English. And that's where it switches to relying on your English students to start giving you some of that language, because they'll recognize, like for egg, they'll recognize, oh, huevo, that's egg, and they'll be happy to give you that language. The other way you could do it is to literally take the poster and pass it off. So your teacher in Spanish would start, she does that pre-work, and then she physically moves it when the kids go over onto their English side. You take that poster, then you pick up and do that. So that's another option. It could look at a couple different ways. And it doesn't have to be all done in one day. You could do it where you did, it's going to be a Thursday and a Friday thing. So there's like a half hour on Thursday afternoon and then a half hour on Friday afternoon that you do the next part. So there's a lot of flexibility. And again, on this, and I'll reiterate it at the end, but it might not, like no child ever died from not having a great bridge experience or a great language transfer experience. We are learning as well as the kids on how to do this and how to be better teachers for students. So trying it out, and it doesn't have to be perfect and it doesn't have to look the same every time. And you might not do it for every unit initially. It might kind of be a staggered start and, well, let's try it with this and then see how it goes. And that's okay. It's a growth mindset for kids, for staff, and for program as well. That's all right. And just as we're talking about too, I typically talk about, and a lot of times the bridge is referenced more from Spanish to English, but you can certainly go the opposite way too. If you're doing something in English at the end of that unit, it might be very helpful and very valuable to have that transfer time into Spanish. And the goal again is not just that you're translating at the end, but that you are helping to build linguistic awareness and those meta-linguistic skills so that students understand how the two languages work. So how that would look or how you would do it. So first you would decide with the bridge, what type. So based on the words and what you've been doing and your concepts and content, what would be the most appropriate structure for how your bridge would look? And we saw in there, we actually saw two. They did two different kind of posters for the same one. And you could do that. You could do a mix. So one type, you'd have an illustration. And I love this one because it's math, and we so don't get to see math all the time. But if you have like an actual illustration and you are labeling different parts, if you have your book, there's an example of another illustration version of a bridge poster on page 139. And they have different labels of a fish. So it might look like you actually have a poster that you put up, that you draw, you've been using, and then now you're going to add the other language to that. It could also look like a side by side. And this she did in the video as well too, closer to the end. So they did the illustration with the cycle and labeling the different parts of cycle in Spanish, and then they added the English under it. And then they also did this side by side with, they listed all of the words in Spanish, and then they went and listed them in English. And again, this is not something that the teacher's just making. You are relying on the students to give you those words, and they might have a hard time, and so you can help them. But the goal is that you are using their linguistic abilities and their language to pull from them. And then the así se dice, or I think it's as I say, or close to that. Someone can help me with the actual translation of así se dice. But is where you have it more as a dictation or more written as a paragraph or word choice. So you would write it all, a very short kind of summary, or it might be a little passage that you're having the students say back to you. So they're summarizing the unit understanding or the main idea. And then we go back and add it. How would we say this in English? And that, or in Spanish, in the other language. And that gives you the opportunity to play with the language a little differently and look at different characteristics of the language. And I think I have another example of what it could look like with an illustration or a graphic. So in another science example with the different states of matter. Or in another very illustrative example, so if you could physically have, and this might be within the first couple months of kindergarten, and you're talking about like me, my school, my neighborhood, and so you actually have a map and different places that you've labeled, and then going back and adding the other language to that. So there's a lot of variation on how you could play with this. The goal again is that you're focusing on the language transfer and different characteristics of the language. It doesn't have to look the exact same every time. The other thing to really call out, just to notice, is that English is all in one color and Spanish is all in one color. And whatever two colors you
I lost you guys.
Julie, we lost you, and the last comment you made was,
So
Julie.
you did, what type are we doing?
Wait, Julie, wait.
Yeah.
We lost you when you were saying English is in one color, Spanish is in another color, and...
I see it popped up. Yep. So English is in one color and Spanish is in, back up, is in another color, to really just drive the point of building the students' awareness between the two languages. Because as we said again, there are some words that are cognates or false cognates, that they look the same, they're spelled the same, but they don't have the same meaning or pronunciation at all. So just to really keep it firm in their mind, because as we mentioned, when students are coming to you and as they're learning the language, they're going to be playing with it and pulling from all of their linguistic repertoire to make sentences, to make sense of things. And so they might jump in and out of Spanish and English, or start to mix and do some Spanglish things. And so using those two colors in your classroom, and hopefully between your co-teacher, and then hopefully also for your whole program at your school, that those would stay consistent to help support students as they're building those skills in their brain. And so then just to continue too, so step one of the bridge, what type, what is it going to look like? And then you're going to ask yourself, well, what is the focus? So you know that you're going to be comparing the words, but then once you have those, the language, the words up there, what are we going to focus on between those? And so the different categories that you could focus on, and this is on page 142 in your book. There's an absolutely lovely chart on it. Okay, so there's a lovely chart on page 142 that explains the different focuses, but you would focus either on phonology. So that's where you're looking at different sound and letter correlation. Or you could look at morphology, so how word formation is and the use of cognates or word endings or prefixes, things like that. You could focus on syntax and grammar, so actual sentence structure, the use of different articles or word sentence or sentence and word choice / order, and then also the pragmatics, so the language use and the cultural norms of the language. And that would probably be kind of as you get a little older, but kind of going into the Pone versus Hatch, that there's different word choices or different ways to say something depending on your context. And the goal with this bridge is that it would make sense for what you're doing. At the kindergarten level, you're probably going to focus more on phonology. Oh, thanks, Pablo. That's hilarious. You're going to focus more on phonology and morphology, and then maybe some syntax and grammar too. But that makes sense at the kindergarten and first grade level, that you're going to focus more on like foundational skills. And then as students get older, then you kind of go more into grammar and pragmatics and doing language choice or word choice. The other hope would be that as you're planning this, you're not going to do the same thing all the time. It would be very easy to jump into cognates. Like that would be the first thing, of course, because, you know, whenever you're looking at language, cognates, especially as adults, that makes sense to us. But if you only are focusing on cognates, then they're not going to get a broad or a full understanding of language and the characteristics and how those two languages work and compare and contrast with each other. So focusing on what is the part or the linguistic analysis that we're going to do. And then once you decide what your focus is, and that's on page 142, where there's a nice chart. Then you go into the meta-linguistic chart. So that first one we had with the illustration or the así se dice or the side-by-side was just putting language on the paper, and it should be the words and the vocabulary that you've used with students. So they know the words, they're giving you the language. But then once you dive into the meta-linguistic skills that you want to focus on, that's where it transfers to a new chart. And so this goes beyond just the unit language, what I was kind of just saying. This is where you're going to start to get other examples from students. And then this chart also is what lives all year long. So if you think about hanging up your anchor charts, you might have the life cycle of a butterfly on your wall for only so long. But the thing you want to keep, the bridge part that you want to have up, are these meta-linguistic charts, because the goal would be that students continue to use them as they're writing, as they're reading, as they're speaking, and then you can also add to them. So what those look like, this is an example of the word ending, so morphology on word formation, and so how ARY is the kind of equivalent ending in English to RIA in Spanish. And then again, the F sound, which would be more phonology, the F sound in English versus the F sound in Spanish. Or again, on phonology and sound, so the different ways to spell the E sound, which in Spanish would be the letter I, but then in English we have different ways to spell the sound E. And again, notice that there's two different colors. So they're using red for Spanish and then black or brown for English. I hope that's not the colors they would have all year long, but I don't know. Another metalinguistic chart, this one looking at the order. So this would be in syntax of putting the noun before the adjective in Spanish, or in English, putting the adjective before the noun. And then again in syntax and word order, but then it also kind of goes into morphology of the different forms of the verb. And in English, you need to have the to, and then in Spanish, it just ends in AR. And what I like about these ones that I have are that you can see the students added their own too. So the first example, like grupo igual, or equal groups, or on this one, calentar is to heat up and enfriar is to cool down. Those probably came from the unit. It looks like they were just doing some math or science, and that was part of their vocabulary. But then the other things are what students added that went beyond the using. So then you're calling on students to give their own input and their own ideas. And again, you'd start in one language and go down the list, and then switch and go into English. And sometimes students, they'll bounce back and forth. They won't stay in just one language the whole time, because we know students don't do that. They're excited. But that's teaching. And so if you are doing it with a two teacher model, I think it would be really exciting to do it as a team and do co-teaching with it. But it's what works best for you, and you could always play around. A couple other examples. So here's the cognates one. So again, more of exactly what you would expect on just the side-by-side, and finding cognates, and you can add to it throughout the year. And then this one I really, really liked is contrasting the word tabla versus table, and how it's used differently in the two languages. So in English, table is just one word that has multiple meanings. And then in Spanish, tabla and mesa are two different things, but in English, we use the same word for both. So just giving that example of word choice and what's more correct. So things like that. So that is your bridge. And again, your bridge, it's a big deal because it's one of the things that is different between dual language education in Bremerton School District versus a monolingual classroom. But it's not that big of a deal that it is changing or disrupting, how teaching as you know it. It is a lesson that is happening at the end of your unit to just build those metalinguistic skills in your students. And then after the bridge happens, you've had 4 to 6 weeks of instruction, you do your metalinguistic, you do your transfer bridge, and then you do your metalinguistic focus bridge to build up all those language skills. Then we get to the most exciting thing, I think, which are the extension activities. And the extension activities, oh, I should have one more coming, is really just intended to extend their learning. It's the same word, but it's really just intended to extend their learning in the other language. And it would hopefully incorporate all 4 language domains in that other language and use the exact words you just found. So if you went back to your bridge, and maybe it's I'll just go with your side-by-side. So we have our cognates. You would use that same list of words. You're not reinventing anything. You're using that same list of words now that you've transferred from Spanish to English. You're using that English vocabulary to then do an activity so that students get the opportunity to practice and play with them and play with the language. So here's where you're asking them to push. And it can be very fun. It does not have to be something big or ongoing. It is a one-day lesson and activity that they do to just give them some exposure. So we're going to watch a video of that and then talk a little bit more. During this, you're going to kind of keep on the same questions that you watched for the last video. So what language do you see or hear the students using? And then also thinking about how are the students transferring the content in the other language? So where is that transfer of concept development?